Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our celebration of 10,000 subscribers. Oh my gosh, there are 10,000 people in the world who are actually interested in mental health documentation enough to subscribe to this channel, which is kind of crazy, right? Not surprising. I have 20,000 therapists on my email list. So there's at least 20,000 people who are interested enough to give me an email. So that's pretty crazy. All right. If you are here live, go ahead and type something in the chat. Let us know you're here. Let us know where you're coming from. If you have a question, this is Q&A. So I have some questions prepped already, questions that I've gotten from, had sent to me from people. But if you have a question live, we will be prioritizing that. So go ahead and put your question in the chat. Hi, Mary Sunshine from upstate New York. Awesome to have you here. So this is going to be quick and casual, just Q&A, time to get any questions you have answered about all things documentation or, I'm kind of an open book, anything else really, but you're probably subscribed to a mental health documentation channel because that's what you're into. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. Yeah, quick and casual. I am in an empty apartment because I'm in the middle of moving. But I really wanted to do something. So it's not going to be a party. I would have liked to have like a little party hat and all kinds of stuff, but we'll do that for 20,000 instead. All right. So let's get started with questions. And you can let me know if you have your own questions in the chat. Thanks for the congratulations. Okay. So one question I've been getting actually quite a bit recently is I attended another training or something like that on documentation, and I heard that using checkboxes is bad in your progress notes because insurance companies don't want to see that. So why am I recommending checkboxes all the time, right? Okay, so a little backstory there. Most of us who do these trainings and work with therapists in whatever capacity like this, we all talk, we all know one another, have group chats, all that kind of stuff. So there are some other great documentation trainings, and a lot of them, though, focus specifically on insurance, or a lot of the feedback that they're giving is based on insurance. So can you use checkboxes for insurance? Yes. However, there's a caveat. Just like any answer I always give, it's never just yes or no. It depends, right? So when you use checkboxes, you want to be really careful about it. So you do not want to use most checkboxes that come from any kind of template that you found in an electronic health record. So they will have checkboxes that say things like CBT for your interventions, for example, right? Intervention section, it'll have checkboxes like mindfulness, CBT, motivational interviewing. It'll have all these other things. And those are not detailed enough. So they're not specific enough. They're not specific to the intervention because CBT, for example, is like 1,000 different interventions. It's a modality, it's a method, it's a class that you take in grad school. It's, a bunch of different things, but it is not one intervention. Same thing even with mindfulness training or a lot of the other ones. So a lot of these interventions you'll see in an EHR are actually like broad modalities. That's what you don't want to do. Don't use those. What you can do as far as checkboxes go, think of checkboxes as the same as like a cheat sheet for yourself, which I would highly recommend having, because you can do that even if you're working in an agency or you work for a group practice where you have to use whatever template they gave you. You can always create a little cheat sheet for yourself. So you want to have probably about 15 interventions that you frequently use with clients and have those pre-written so you're not actually writing them out all the time. It helps with the thinking about documentation because you just kind of look at this list and you're like, oh yeah, I did this, I did that, I did this. And then you can either copy and paste those into a note or you can check them off. But you do want them to be more specific. So instead of CBT, it would be like one of your check boxes or one of your cheat sheet bullet points would be challenged cognitive distortions. or challenged all or nothing thinking, or discussed the concept of all or nothing thinking, provided psychoeducation around all or nothing thinking, provided psychoeducation on the difference between thoughts and feelings, right? So all of those are CBT related, but different interventions that you may or may not use all the time. Same thing, mindfulness training, right? So introduce the concept of mindfulness, provided psychoeducation on how mindfulness impacts sleep, on how mindfulness impacts trauma, etc. Um, demonstrated deep breathing techniques, right? So there are these different aspects of mindfulness that are all more specific interventions. So based on what you do on a frequent basis, you can sort of collect those things. If you've been in practice for a while, you can go through, like, don't even worry about making it up. Go through all your old notes. You've already done the work and just start jotting down or, typing out all of the interventions that you frequently provide and create your own cheat sheet that way. So you can kind of look at checkboxes as a cheat sheet. There's very similar things, and basically they have the same purpose. So that's why I do recommend checkboxes, but make them more specific. And so actually me and the other therapists who are doing these trainings are in agreement. Okay, let's see questions. Hi, Chad from Oregon. And Angelica says, thoughts on what to do if you never did treatment plans and you have been working with a client for years and you take insurance? Yes, this is really common, right? So there's same thing happens with progress notes even. So if you haven't done a treatment plan and you've been working with a client for years, just do one the next time you see them. So the next time, and I always recommend you do treatment plans in person with clients so that you're not spending that time on documentation after the fact, and so that they're involved in the process. So it makes it easier for you and it actually makes it more clinically relevant. So your next session with them, then go in and do the treatment plan. If you want, there is a video that was released, I think, like last month. It's just a few videos down on what goes in a treatment plan. So really focus, even if you work with insurance, really just kind of focusing on the basics of, like, what are their treatment goals? I have a video on how I think you really only need 2 for most clients. And then the real basic meat of a treatment plan is treatment goals. What are you going to do to help them? So your interventions, and what is the client going to do to also meet those goals, right? So the client participation. Those are really the 3 main pieces of any treatment plan. There are other things you could add in there, but if you're just kind of trying to catch up and working on things, focus on that and literally just tell them, hey, I realize we haven't, so you can kind of introduce it to people as, I wouldn't say, hey, I'm supposed to do treatment plans. I haven't done one. We've been working together for 2 years. But I would say, like, you could say, hey, I just attended a training and they talked about treatment plans. And so I wanted to go through that with you and make sure we're on the same page with what we're working on. You can use a time frame as a reference point and say, hey, we've been working together for this long, and I just wanted to check in and make sure we're still on the same page about what you wanted to work on, what your goals are, how that might be changing over time. So those are some different ways that you can bring it up and just make it very casual, and um, and and don't be afraid to kind of blame insurance when you need to. So for example, if you're sitting down with a client to write a treatment plan and you want to, kind of use 3 sections that I was describing, and you want to kind of make the goals sound somewhat clinical and not just write down whatever, you can always blame insurance. So go ahead and say, like, you said whatever. Hey, how are you okay with us wording it this way? Because this is kind of how insurance wants to see it. You can also blame insurance for having to do a treatment plan, right? Like, if you're in your EHR and it's complicated and you can't figure out what to do, you can just say, hey, you know what? Give me just a second. I'm trying to figure this out. Um, my electronic health record, needs us to write it this way, or insurance needs us to write it this way. So it's okay to do that. And most people get that. Like, everyone, here in the US pretty much understands, like, insurance companies can be frustrating and have different requirements and want healthcare providers to do things certain ways. So feel free to do that. You have my permission anyways, maybe not theirs. And along with that, Okay, let's go on to the next question is, what do I do with those notes, in quotation marks, I take during session? Yes, just reminders of what was said. So like if you're kind of meeting, this is really common, you're meeting with a client and you're just kind of taking notes to yourself just so you remember certain things, right? And maybe after the session, you find whatever you wrote down wasn't that important. Sometimes it is really helpful, right? You get kind of runs the gamut there. Can I keep these in the paper chart I have or shred after session? Yes, you can do either one. So if it's one of those notes where you're like, I was writing it down and it was kind of like, okay, but not something I'm really going to find value in later or need, just shred it. Basically, those are your psychotherapy notes, right? They're your notes to yourself. The purpose of them is for you to, whether it's just for memory's sake, to remember what to put in the progress note, or because you thought something might be important, but then it wasn't. They're your psychotherapy notes. So I would treat them as such, keep them separate from the file, the regular client file. And that way you can just shred them if you want to, or if there's one maybe that you want to keep because you had some quote or something that you wrote down that you thought would be helpful, then you can keep that one. But kind of think of them as your psychotherapy notes so that you're using that same framework for how to manage them. Then the next question is suggestions if one does not want to use an electronic health record or EHR for notes. Yeah. So I find that a lot of people are actually are enjoying a hybrid method. So if you use an electronic health record or an EHR, it's really helpful for things like intake and just kind of overall management of client records because it's all in one spot. You can access it from anywhere. So especially if you are kind of working sometimes from home, but sometimes in your office. For example, if you have like a paper file in an office, then you're really stuck with like, what if you're sick and someone needs to call the client to let them know to cancel a session? It's like someone would have to go to an office to access those records. So an electronic health record solves all those problems. So I really do recommend everyone use some type of electronic health record just for basic client practice management. That doesn't mean you have to use all aspects of it or do your notes that way. So let's say you're someone who just really likes paper and maybe you have I've seen some people who've created like an awesome template for themselves and it's like one sheet, one page, and it has checkboxes and they can do their notes really easily and they do them during session. You can have a hybrid record. And that's just what it's called, a hybrid record, where maybe everything like the intake, I would recommend doing in an electronic health record. It saves you a ton of time because you can have clients fill everything out online and they can fill everything out ahead of time. And it's all in one spot again. And an electronic health record is going to protect your client's information better than you ever could, better than you ever could dream. So whether you keep your own records on paper, in a file cabinet, in an office, in whatever location, whether you keep them on your computer, like everything's encrypted, whether you keep it all saved there. I know people who have had their computers stolen. I know people who have had their offices broken into and files rifled through. I know people who have had their offices burned down. I know people who have had their offices flooded. So there's just no way that you can protect client information the same way a huge company who specializes in that kind of thing can. So I do just want to, not that this is part of the question, but I do just want to make sure everyone is aware, like the information is really safe if you're using a trusted electronic health record system. But if you practically are just like, my notes aren't getting done because I'm not going to do them if I have to log into the system and do them. Any note is better than no note. That's one of my mantras. So get your notes done. So if you do them on paper, keep them in that paper file and everything else in the electronic health record. That's the easiest way to do it. And you can always just, if you want to be extra cautious, make a note in the electronic health record that says all progress notes kept via paper. That's it. That's all you need to do. And then what I would recommend if you choose that method is maybe when you like close that client out, just scan all those paper progress notes into one document. So it might be like one PDF that has like 200 pages or 20 pages, however long you saw the person. And upload it as an attachment to that client's file in your electronic health record, and then you can shred them. That way you're not saving paper for older clients or, former clients, but you still have everything. It's all secure, it's easy to manage, and it's done. But, and you could also do that once a year, right? You could do it once a month. There's all these different ways you could do that. But that's kind of the easiest way to manage a hybrid record. So yeah, great question that I actually get probably more often than you would think. Next question is, can clinical conceptualization thoughts also go into psychotherapy notes? Absolutely. So, I'll use an example from my own experience. So, for example, I was working with a student at one point many, many years ago, and I kind of had suspicions that the student was being sexually abused, but I had no hard evidence. So that's not something I would ever put in a client's actual file, right? Because I had no evidence. It's not like they gave me any type of quote or anything like that. It was more of a gut feeling and kind of like based on very odd things they were saying. Um, so that was just kind of my own personal theory that I was investigating and kind of curious about, right? I would never put that in a client progress note because I had no hard evidence. It was a personal feeling, but that could absolutely go in a psychotherapy note. If I wanted to especially kind of like conceptualize it and maybe think through it and try to write it down and kind of think through like what is making me think this, what were the little cues that I was maybe picking up on, right? Those are the things that would be good in a psychotherapy note because it's kind of helping me with that. Same thing with case conceptualization. So if you're just kind of formulating things, another example is like I had a client who had ADHD, and then based on some behavior that was happening months into treatment, it was like, actually, maybe this is bipolar disorder, right? But again, it's one of those things that you're kind of thinking through and paying attention to. It's not like one specific day you're going to have that first thought and then boom, change the diagnosis, especially for a diagnosis like that, right? So that was something that was more like, oh, let me write down some of these thoughts and kind of think through conceptualizing this case and what's going on here. So any other case conceptualization stuff, absolutely. Things like genograms, if you just kind of find it helpful to write those out. A genogram is an example of something that could go in the client file, or if it's just kind of you writing it out because maybe you like family systems theory or something like that, and you just wanted to do it, then you could also keep it as a psychotherapy note. All right. Other questions from our live attendees? If not, I will go to one of the ones that was sent to me, which was, how do I deal with perfectionism when writing my notes? So this is something I also hear a lot. And there's a lot of different things. So one is the mantra that, Angelica, yes, this is being recorded. So this will be available on the channel live or on the channel later. And I will include some resources and notes underneath here. There are a lot of reasons that perfectionism can pop up when writing notes. So one thing that's helpful is to look at like, what is this about? So for example, I've worked with people where this is just kind of their tendency in all of their work. So is this a matter of kind of your overall management of these perfectionistic tendencies? Or is this, for some people, it's a matter of lack of confidence around their clinical work, right? So sometimes you'll see this with newer therapists, especially who receive very little training on how to do notes, and they want to make a good impression and they're trying to do a good job. And so they don't know what's good enough. And so they really overanalyze as they're doing notes and think about everything. And it takes them a really long time to write the note. And oftentimes, if you kind of started out that way, you might be a therapist who's been licensed for 15 years, but that's still your practice because that's kind of how everything started. And you never really got that good feedback about notes. On the flip side, some therapists have gotten really negative feedback on their notes without getting support. So if that's you, if a supervisor ever shared something with you like, oh, your notes are terrible, or how come you didn't know how to do this or whatever, that was not an appropriate way for them to give you feedback at all. That's on them. And it can be very traumatic for a lot of therapists. And so then it's very easy to sit there and again doubt yourself, question yourself, and really play into this perfectionism. So a lot of times perfectionism really has to do with doubt, with self-doubt, and not trusting ourselves, and not trusting that you're doing the process correctly, or that you know it. So depending on where you might be within those various scenarios or something else, that's kind of your answer for how to deal with the problem. So that's what I usually recommend, is looking at why do you have these perfectionistic tendencies, and then addressing that head on. One of the easiest ways, one of the ways I can specifically help people with that, is like the training aspect. So if you just feel like, I never knew what to put in a note, I never feel like my notes were good enough, I never got good feedback on my notes, I don't know what to put in there, and so I sit there and obsess over it, that's where you can check out my videos. And I would say the free private practice paperwork crash course gives you some quick tips on writing notes. That course is like 8 years old, and I'm hoping to re-record it next year. So we'll have some improved examples and stuff like that. But really, a lot of this documentation stuff doesn't change dramatically, so it still checks out. But that's what I would say. There's a free course available to you. There are free handouts. I will link below this video a free handout that is a therapy interventions list, for example. So that's something that helps a lot of people, because usually the struggle with writing notes and what's put in there is, how do I word what I'm doing with interventions? So you can check out the interventions list. And the other struggle is like what to put in it, right? What actually goes in the note, what that goes in there. So one of the things that usually goes in any note, is topics. So you can say like, topics discussed. And that can just be a flat thing that you put in every note, no matter what template you're using of any kind. Topics discussed, and then use phrases. So there's no rule that I'm aware of that notes have to be in full sentences. Use bullet points when you can. Topics discussed, argument with spouse, feelings of anxiety, problems at school. There's just using those phrases is good enough for a note. Really hits home the point and is much easier for you to write, right? It takes me a little bit longer because I'm making it up off the top of my head, but I would absolutely recommend kind of focusing on those two things, and all the other stuff is fluff usually. Then it's just kind of client presentation, and what's your plan for the next session. Those are really like the four main things you want to have in a note. And anytime you use checkboxes to save yourself time, you do not then need to write further. So a lot of times I'll work with therapists, and they start using checkboxes and it saves them. And they're like, oh yeah, like I'm using the checkboxes. It feels a lot easier, but I haven't really saved any time. Then when we look at their note together, I find that they're still writing a whole narrative of what happened and basically like re-explaining the checkboxes. So there is no need to do that. My other rule is never write anything twice. So if you already checked it off or wrote it somewhere else, just put C wherever else you wrote it. All right, Lisa asks, are you seeing a decline in new therapists coming into the field or leaving the field due to the insane amounts of documentation? I love this field, but documentation resentment is taking a toll on me. I'm not seeing a decline in that, but I will what I've seen an increase in is working with therapists who have been licensed for years, and the documentation is taking a toll on them. And I hear this almost every week. I'm thinking about letting my license lapse and becoming a life coach instead, or becoming a coach instead, because my personal theory is that I think coaching, so for example, I graduated grad school in 2008. Back then, coaching was not quite as popular. I think it was more just like an executive coaching kind of thing, maybe that professional people did. But as a therapist, it would have been like, oh my gosh, no, like we're so much better than a coach is, right? And now I feel like coaching is so much more accepted that a lot of therapists who really hate the paperwork part of it are like, I could basically do the same thing, but not have as much liability and not have to do all this documentation. So why don't I just become a coach? And so, yes, I hear a lot. And it really is sad because yes, there is, it's not just the documentation, it's also the liability aspect, I think, and the restrictions, right? So like we're restricted to working with people usually that are within the state in which we're licensed. Whereas if you're a coach, it doesn't matter. Your client can move and you can still see them. So unfortunately, those restrictions and ideas, which I think are in place for a good reason originally, um, in some ways, the internet, like we're kind of outgrowing some of that stuff. And in some ways, I think our field, our profession, just kind of needs to catch up with not necessarily being more lax, but um, being more realistic. I think about how work is going and what's happening there. So yeah, and documentation resentment, I will say that's something I see a lot, obviously, um, and had a lot. And I think a lot of that too, it really comes from those of us who had negative experiences with supervisors or agencies or both in the beginning of our career. And we really feel a lot of pressure around documentation. Like it's this huge deal, it's super important, um, and have all the liability fears and all of that. And really, documentation, yes, it is important. Again, it's important enough that 10,000 people are subscribed to a YouTube channel on it, right? Um, but it's not everything, right? And it really shouldn't be the main focus of our work. It should not be your main source of stress. For a lot of therapists, it really is their main source of stress around their job. And that's why I say, um, working to create like systems and structures around your documentation, making it easier will help dramatically. And that way you don't have that resentment and that stress. Also, this is where we need to get involved with advocacy stuff with insurance because um, it's not a matter of us just complaining and not doing anything about all these insurance requirements and insurance being so stringent on who's doing what and limitations with insurance. Like that's our role to explain to clients what insurance is requiring of us and to expect to be paid more by insurance and to talk to the powers that be about all of the craziness that insurance requires. So that's really on us. Okay, let's see. And looks like no more questions. We'll stay on for another 2 minutes if you guys have more, because this is kind of like last call for live questions. Go ahead and write your question in the chat. And let's see, what's a quick one I can add from my list here. So what's the difference? What do I put in objective and subjective? So this is a question I get on SOAP notes. What goes in objective? What goes in subjective? I hate SOAP notes because I feel like it's whatever you want it to be. It's whatever you want to put in there. Okay. So I usually just recommend like just pick a structure to have around that and just do it the same way every time. So objective, you can kind of think of as more like the objective stuff that happened. So like topics included, just put in your objective section for a SOAP note, topics included, and what you discussed, or sorry, topics discussed, like during the session. That can be your objective. Then in the subjective, you could put the client progress statement. So I usually recommend, especially if you do work with insurance, use a client progress statement. I have a whole list of samples of client progress statements and a whole template that you can use. I will link to that below the recording of this video. And that way, boom, those two are covered. Put whatever else in your assessment, and your plan is what you plan to do next. So it's really just kind of figuring out, what do you think of those kind of 4 things I said you want to have in a progress note? Where do they go in the note? Otherwise, subjective and objective, it's just made up. And every like structure that I've ever looked at, like framework, like from insurance companies or different agencies or whatever, they all pick different things to put in each section. So there is no standard. There is no right way to do it. It's just pick a way to do it and be consistent. All right. Well, it's been half an hour. Gosh, that went by fast. So looks like we don't have any more questions. We've already done half an hour. I think that's good enough. Please make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. You will get more tips. We're going to be tackling documentation myths over the next 4 weeks and going through that. And yeah, thank you for joining us so much. Thank you for those of you who have questions. And until next time, happy writing.